Ever walk away from, like, a talk with someone, and it's like you were staring into a funhouse mirror, you know?
Yeah.
Like, all their hangups and anxieties, that's all you could see.
It's true. Sometimes our inner world can be a bit of a funhouse, right?
Yeah, totally. And that's what we're diving into today. Psychological projection. We've got, let's see, some classic psychology stuff, even some research from Chinese psychology, all about how our own thoughts and feelings can really color how we see other people.
And it's often not even a choice, which I think is what makes it so interesting and maybe a little tricky sometimes.
Like our sources call it, it's a psychological hot potato, right?
Hmm.
We just chuck our own uncomfortable feelings or whatever onto other people without even realizing it. But why? Why do we do that?
It's basically self-preservation, right? Our mind's way of protecting itself,
Hmm.
By shifting those unwanted traits or feelings onto someone else, we kind of dodge having to deal with them ourselves. It's like a defense mechanism, a way to keep a good self-image.
Easier to point the finger than look in the mirror, huh?
In a lot of ways, yeah. And this whole passing on of emotional uh, burdens, it's something that's really explored in Chinese psychology. They talk about the harm of covering and transmitting projections, this idea that we pass on our anxieties and insecurities to others without realizing
It
it.
makes you think about how often this probably happens. In families, with friends, even at work, I bet.
Oh, absolutely. Just picture a boss, right? The kind who micromanages everyone, nitpicks every little thing. Could be that they're super insecure about being competent, so they overcompensate.
You know, I never thought of it that way before, but it makes a lot of sense. We always think of a micromanager as just wanting control,
Hmm.
but maybe it's deeper than that.
And to that point about the whole covering and transmitting thing, imagine if that boss, right? What if they grew up with a parent who was obsessed with achievement, never seemed happy?
So they kind of absorb all that anxiety and pressure, but instead of dealing with it, they cover it up by, I don't know, trying to be perfect. And then they just end up transmitting that same pressure onto their team.
Yeah.
Wow. So it's like this, like a chain reaction of unaddressed emotions almost.
Hmm.
But it's not always about flaws we're projecting, right?
You're right. It can be any feeling or impulse we haven't really dealt with. Like, take a partner who's always accusing the other person of being too clingy or needy.
When really it's them who wants to feel closer but can't express it.
Exactly. They might see those needs as weak, something to be ashamed of, so it's easier to just kind of put them on their partner instead.
It's way easier to say you're being too clingy than to say, I'm scared of being alone.
Hmm.
You see that in relationships all the time, right?
All the time. And speaking of, one of the Chinese sources mentioned this idea of projecting our ideal partner onto someone.
Oh, that's asking for trouble, right? Like trying to
Right.
shove someone into a box they don't fit in.
And they're always going to fall short because, well, nobody can live up to some fantasy.
Okay, so this is all making sense, but it's kind of daunting
Yeah.
too, you know? Like, how are we supposed to do relationships if everyone's just projecting their stuff all over the place?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it leads us to the most important part of our deep dive today. How do we deal with these projections, both in ourselves and from others, in a way that's healthy and actually helps?
And hopefully avoid any more funhouse mirror moments.
Well, to navigate this whole projection thing, you got to start by turning things inward. It all comes down to self-awareness.
So like taking a second to ask yourself, hold on, is this really about them or is it me?
Exactly. The more we get our own stuff, our insecurities, our buttons, the better we are at figuring out if someone's actually upset with us or if it's their own stuff bubbling up.
Which is like way easier said than done, and
Yeah.
especially in the moment.
Yeah.
Anything in the research about how to actually do that, like hit the brakes when you're feeling triggered.
One source had this great question you can ask yourself when that happens. Is this about them or is it something I need to figure out in myself?
So that's good. It's like instead of blaming, you get curious, right?
Right. And sometimes that's all it takes to cool things down. You can approach the conversation with a little more, empathy and understanding.
Instead of getting defensive, you're listening to understand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean you let people walk all over you, but it does mean maybe you can react with a little more self-awareness, maybe even some compassion.
So what about when, like, you can tell someone's projecting
Yeah.
and you try to talk about it, in a healthy way, but it's just not clicking? What then?
There's this phrase for one of the Chinese sources I love, resist the proof trap.
Resist the proof trap, okay? What's that mean?
It's that urge we get, especially when we know someone's projecting, to like lay out all the reasons why they're wrong. But logic doesn't work so well in these situations, because it's not really about logic. It's deeper than that.
Oh, tell me about it. It's like talking to a wall. Doesn't matter what you say, nothing gets through.
Total. So instead of that whole song and dance, The sources say, change the focus.
So not prove them wrong, but what?
Yeah.
What do you do?
If it feels right, you can try turning it back on them, Ask open-ended questions like, what makes you say that? Or help me understand why you feel this way.
So you're helping them dig into their own feelings instead of getting defensive or shutting down the conversation?
Yep. And just that, acknowledging their feelings, even if you don't agree, can sometimes calm things down.
It's like you're holding up a mirror to their emotions so they can see things a little clearer.
Yeah.
But what if you do all that? The self-reflection, the open-ended questions, trying to be understanding, and they just keep projecting.
That's when boundaries are super important.
So with boundaries, what does that actually look like, in real life? How do we protect ourselves, especially when someone keeps projecting onto us and it just feels unhealthy?
Well, it's different for everyone, right? Every situation's different. But it always comes down to respecting yourself. Remember, we can't control what other people do. We can't force them to change. But we get to decide how much we're going to put up with.
Right, right. Sometimes the best thing is just to walk away. Yeah.
Totally. It might be stepping away from the conversation or like not seeing them as much. Or if it's really bad, maybe even ending the relationship. If it's doing more harm than good, you got to put yourself first.
It's a good reminder that putting yourself first isn't selfish, especially with this kind of stuff. But switching gears a bit, I want to touch on something else about projection. This idea that our own, unmet needs, the things we want but don't have, they can change how we see other people.
Oh, yeah, that's such a trip, isn't it? Like we're wearing these glasses that mess with how we see everyone else.
Exactly. And our sources talked about how this happens a lot in close relationships, like someone who always needs validation from their partner.
They're probably projecting their own need for love and affirmation, right? So even like normal things their partner does, they take it as rejection or approval.
And that can cause, a ton of drama for no reason.
For sure. If we don't know what we need, we end up expecting other people to fill that hole for us, and that just leads to disappointment and resentment.
So how do we stop that from happening? How can we see ourselves and our partners for who they really are?
It all comes back to self-reflection. Asking yourself the hard questions. What am I not giving myself? What am I expecting from other people that I should be giving myself?
Instead of making someone else carry your baggage, you take responsibility for it. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's where the magic happens. When you acknowledge your needs and you work on them, it frees you. It frees your relationships from all that unhealthy baggage.
That's huge.
Oh,
It's not about blaming yourself or anyone else. It's about understanding.
that's it. And
Oh.
when you can do that, when you can be understanding and compassionate, it can really, really change things for the better.
This has been, oh man, so insightful. We've really gone deep on psychological projection. We talked about what it is, why we do it, and most importantly, how to deal with it so we can have healthier relationships with ourselves and with everyone else.
It's been great, diving into this with you. Hopefully everyone listening will be able to look at their own projections with a little curiosity, a little kindness for themselves.
I hope so too. And with that, it's time to wrap up our deep dive on psychological projection. But before we go, one last thing to think about. What if the things that drive you crazy about other people, the things that really push your buttons, what if those are actually telling you something about yourself? Something to chew on as you navigate this crazy world of relationships?